Part 2, Still Freedom Time? Let us now turn to consider Gary Wilder's fascinating 2015 book, Freedom Time, Negritude, Decolonization, and the Future of the World, which also focuses on 20th century projects of anti-colonial self-determination. Though these were unrealized projects of self-determination, and crucially, they conceived of decolonization and self-determination differently, as not needing state sovereignty. More specifically, Wilder tells the story of decolonizing projects that might have been, of the unrealized attempts by French, African, and Antillean legislatures and intellectuals during the Fourth and Fifth Republics to invent different forms of decolonization. At the center of his narrative are the figures of Aime Cesaire from Martinique and Leopold Senghor from Senegal, who between 1945 and 1960 served as public intellectuals, party leaders, and deputies in the French National Assembly. Their projects proceeded from a belief that late imperialism had created conditions for new types of transcontinental political association. Wilder emphasizes that both Cesaire and Senghor hoped to overcome colonialism without falling into the trap of national autarky. Indeed, he insists their constitutional initiatives were based on imminent critiques of colonialism and republicanism, identifying elements within each that pointed beyond their existing forms. They not only criticized colonialism from the standpoint of constitutional democracy and self-government, they also criticized unitary republicanism from the standpoint of decentralized, interdependent, plural, and transnational features of imperialism itself. Wilder continues, in different ways, Cesaire and Senghor hoped to fashion a legal and political framework that would recognize the history of interdependence between metropolitan and overseas peoples and protect the latter's economic and political claims on a metropolitan society their resources and labor had helped to create. In the book, Wilder thus tries to get us to question the automatic or necessary equation between decolonization and national self-determination on the one hand, and nation-state sovereignty on the other. He does so by seeking to historicize the post-war logic that reduced colonial emancipation to national liberation and self-determination to state sovereignty. Wilder notes that historical accounts typically focus on stories of confrontations between national states losing overseas possessions and oppressed nations winning independence, and that scholarly debates often focus on decolonization's causes, mechanisms, or outcomes, as well as the so-called transfer of power. However important, he contends, these discussions tend to treat the meaning of decolonization as self-evident by reducing colonial emancipation to national liberation. Underlying such dyadic accounts, he argues, is the assumption that European states had empires, but were not themselves empires. What does Wilder mean by, and what is at stake in such a claim? To get a sense of this, it is worth considering the critique of Depeche Chakrabarty's influential post-colonial manifesto, Provincializing Europe, that Wilder elaborates in his book's first chapter on Unthinking France, Rethinking Decolonization. Wilder begins this critique by acknowledging that understandable fears of totalizing explanation and Eurocentric evaluation have led a generation of scholars to insist on the singularity of Black, African, and non-Western forms of thought. Even so, he contends, we now need to be less concerned with unmasking universalisms as covert European particularisms than with challenging the assumption that the universal is European property. And he goes on to insist, my aim is not to provincialize Europe, but to deprovincialize Africa and the Antilles. Wilder likewise recognizes the force of Chakrabarty's landmark argument that supposedly universal categories were in fact produced within culturally particular European societies. Indeed, he even admits that Cesaire's and Senghor's multiplex reflections on negritude resonate in many ways with Chakrabarty's argument about the existence of incommensurable forms of being and thinking that are often ungraspable by the rationalist protocols of modern historiography. And yet, he goes on to forcefully contend, but their thinking also provides a perspective from which to question Chakrabarty's critique of general, abstract, and universal thought from the standpoint of local, concrete, and particular life worlds. It reveals how the provincializing Europe argument depends partly on a set of territorial assumptions about life worlds, how it tends to collapse people, place, and consciousness, and to ethnicize forms of life, how it equates the abstract and universal with Europe and the concrete and lived with India or Bengal. Moreover, Wilder admits that Chakrabarty argues persuasively that there is an intrinsic connection between forms of life and forms of thought, but he nevertheless chastises Chakrabarty for not proceeding to inquire directly into the scales of life worlds in relation to which thinking is often forged. Indeed, according to Wilder, Chakrabarty seems reluctant to recognize that large social formations and political fields, such as empires, are also concrete places. Wilder further contends that his argument, which takes empire as the unit of analysis, pushes against a recent tendency in comparative history and colonial studies to insist upon multiple, alternative, or counter-modernities on the grounds that such a tendency would grant to Europe possession of a modernity which was always already translocal. Doing so, he contends, comes at both an analytical and a political cost. In his words, what is the analytical and political cost of assigning to Europe such categories or experiences as self-determination, emancipation, equality, justice, and freedom, let alone abstraction, humanity, or universality? Why confirm the story that Europe has long told about itself? Modern, concrete, universalizing processes like capitalism were not confined to Europe, nor were concepts of universality or concepts that became universal simply imposed by Europeans or imitated by non-Europeans. They were elaborated relationally and assumed a range of meanings that crystallized concretely through use. Wilder continues by noting that Chakrabarty recognizes that the intellectual heritage of Enlightenment thought is now global and that he writes from within this inheritance. Wilder points to the eloquent reminder with which Chakrabarty concludes that provincializing Europe cannot ever be a project of shunning European thought, for at the end of European imperialism, European thought is a gift to us all. We can talk of provincializing it only in an anti-colonial spirit of gratitude. And so he acquits Chakrabarty of any false charge of being a provincial or nativist thinker. Even so, Wilder goes on to insist that Chakrabarty's conception of gratitude concedes too much at the outset to Europe as wealthy benefactor and to a liberal conception of private property. Wilder, by contrast, contends that modernity was, in fact, a global process to begin with, and that, as such, its concepts are a common legacy that already belong to all humanity. They are not Europe's to give. Indeed, he concludes, they are the product of what Susan Buck-Morse has recently called universal history, the gift of the past, and the communism of the idea. In taking Cesaire's and Senghor's unfulfilled projects of self-determination without state sovereignty seriously, Wilder's account attempts a deterritorialization of social thought, a decolonization of intellectual history, even a globalization of critical theory. His aim is not to get us to valorize non-European forms of knowledge. Rather, it is to get us to question the presumptive boundaries of France or Europe themselves. Humanism, cosmopolitanism, and universalism are categories in which Cesaire and Senghor were certainly interested, Wilder insists. But more significantly still, these figures tried to reclaim, rethink, and refunction such categories by overcoming the abstract registers in which they were conventionally formulated, hoping to realize them through intercontinental political formations. According to Wilder, Cesaire and Senghor sought to do more than just secure a favorable place for their peoples within the existing international order. They sought to transcend it. Theirs was not simply a pursuit of sovereignty. It was a vision of unprecedented arrangements for dwelling and thinking through which humanity could realize itself more fully. In Wilder's evocative words, from the evanescent opening of the post-war moment, they anticipated a new era of world history in which human relations would be reorganized on the basis of complementarity, mutuality, and reciprocity. Through these novel political arrangements, humanity might overcome the alienating antinomies that had impoverished the quality of life in overseas colonies and European metropoles. Like Negritude, Wilder also claims to take inspiration in the work of David Scott, whose important 2004 book, Conscripts of Modernity, Wilder describes as both powerfully challenging the nationalist orthodoxies of anti-colonial thinking and centering historical temporality as an analytic and political problem. Wilder flags in particular Scott's contention that what ought to be at stake in historical inquiry is a critical appraisal of the present itself, not the mere reconstruction of the past. In such a vein, Wilder understands his own work of historical recovery to be directly related to the demands of our political present. To this end, Wilder employs and tweaks Scott's provocative notion of futures past, which Scott himself adapts from the historian Reinhard Koselleck. While for Scott, in an argument to which we shall return, revolutionary anti-colonialism's dream of national sovereignty became a historically superseded and politically obsolete future past after failing to secure political freedom for colonized peoples and can no longer meaningfully animate emancipatory projects in radical conditions, for Wilder, the point is somewhat different. He is not primarily concerned with futures past, whose promise faded after imperfect implementation, nor with those that corresponded to a world or to hopes that no longer exist. Instead, he is concerned to recover futures past that were once imagined but never came to be, alternatives that might have been, and whose unrealized emancipatory potential may now be recognized and reawakened as durable and vital legacies. Wilder emphasizes the dual nature of decolonization. On the one side, it represented an emancipatory awakening of peoples, and simultaneously on the other, a heteronomous process of imperial restructuring. Yet most actors and agencies on both sides of the imperial divide tended to share the assumption that self-determination meant state sovereignty. Cesaire and Senghor, by contrast, refused to reduce decolonization to national independence. This refusal on their part, Wilder argues, derived from their convictions about the difference between formal liberation and substantive freedom. Moreover, there was both a pragmatic and an ethical dimension to this refusal. According to Wilder, pragmatically, they believed that autarkic national solutions could not adequately address the problem of colonial freedom in an epoch of global interdependence. Ethically, they believed that the history of imperial entanglement allowed them to claim the legacies, resources, and rights supposedly reserved for metropolitans. In different ways, Cesaire and Senghor both called for the radical reconfiguration of political relations within the French Empire, for its transformation into a multinational democratic federation. Wilder urges us to imagine what might have been had such a vision been realized. He contends, African sans-papiers in metropolitan France would not be foreigners demanding hospitality, but citizens whose rights of mobility, family reunification, social security, and political participation were legally protected. Africans would not be outsiders appealing for economic aid from a foreign French state, nor targets of dehumanizing humanitarianism. Violations of their human rights could be adjudicated in the federal justice system rather than depend on the weak ethical norms of international law or the goodwill of powerful nations. West African peoples would be integral members of an expanded European Union. Even more forcefully, Wilder sums up his argument by insisting that the nationalist logic of decolonization has contributed to dispossession. State sovereignty has neither been a recipe for self-determination in post-colonial Africa, nor a guarantor of basic rights for Africans in the metropolitan post-colony. As such, a radical rethinking of what self-determination would require, indeed, a decoupling of the idea from the paradigm of nation-state sovereignty, would seem in order. Cesaire and Senghor stand out as untimely thinkers whose descent from what came to be the hegemonic program and parameters of anti-colonial nationalism in their own era emerges again today, capable of speaking directly to the dilemmas of our era, in which the promises of nation-state sovereignty have come to ring increasingly hollow. As Wilder eloquently insists, the current situation presents the same structural dilemma that Senghor and Cesaire confronted in the post-war opening. Changing historical conditions have challenged the long-standing assumption that territorial sovereignty is the necessary framework for political freedom. These include the close of the Cold War, the dismantling of social welfare states, the failure of the Bandung development states, and the transformation of slum dwellers, immigrants, and stateless refugees around the world into permanent surplus populations. For larger masses of people, decisions by distant, invisible, or unaccountable actors circumscribe their life chances without any mechanisms for redressing harms, let alone participating in defining desirable futures. Meanwhile, responsibilities for global governance are ceded to unelected international bodies, transnational organizations, technical experts, and private corporations. The world community seems unable to create frameworks for self-management adequate to the transnational scale through which decisions about global politics, human futures, and environmental sustainability must be made. Formal independence cannot guarantee substantive freedom in most post-colonial societies. In sum, we seem to be at a conjuncture in which self-determination must take the form of some kind of transnational, if not post-national democracy. Indeed, we can no longer afford to conflate self-determination with nation-state sovereignty. And in this respect, the proleptic writings of Cesaire and Senghor emerge again as most relevant today. As Wilder puts the point, Their writings seem to proceed according to Frederick Jameson's suggestion that utopias in fact come to us as barely audible messages from a future that may never come into being. They also call to mind Benjamin's inverse injunction to listen carefully for a sort of theological whispered intelligence dealing with matters discredited and obsolete. Cesaire and Senghor did precisely this when they identified within an already superseded empire the elements of an unprecedented federal democracy. Their own unrealized programs for self-determination without state sovereignty can thus be regarded as discredited and obsolete matters, in Benjamin's sense, waste products of a perishing present, but from which new futures might just be imagined. With that, we'll take another break.